Welcome to Libeth. Today we are following Bushido past the book, into the schools, the barracks, the corporations, and the catastrophes that a constructed tradition makes possible once it leaves its author's hands. Every nation undergoing rapid transformation requires a myth of continuity, a story that explains how the new thing it is becoming was already implicit in the old thing it was, so that the transformation does not feel like rupture, but like development, not like loss, but like fulfillment. This requirement is structural, not incidental. A society that has dismantled its own institutional order in the space of a generation, that has replaced a feudal hierarchy with a constitutional state, that has built factories where there were rice paddies and a conscript army where there was a warrior class, faces a coherence crisis. The question, who are we now, cannot be answered by pointing to present institutions. They are too new, too obviously constructed, too visibly borrowed from elsewhere. It can only be answered by pointing backward, to something that appears to have always been there, to a tradition that the new institutions are implementing rather than inventing. The tradition that serves this function does not need to be historically accurate. It needs to be believable, and it needs to be useful. Bushido served this function for Meiji Japan more effectively than any competing candidate. Buddhism was available, but was of Chinese and Indian origin. It had entered Japan as a foreign tradition, and the Meiji state was actively trying to subordinate it to Shinto as part of the project of constructing a distinctively Japanese national identity. Shinto was being reconstructed as a state religion centered on the emperor's divine lineage, but the reconstruction was recent and visibly political. It was harder to present as an ancient continuity precisely because the reconstruction was ongoing in public. Bushido offered what neither of them could: a tradition organized around the values the Meiji state needed to promote: loyalty, self-sacrifice, discipline, the subordination of personal interest to higher obligation, presented as a distinctively Japanese ethical inheritance rather than an import or a construction, and formulated in terms that a Western intellectual audience would recognize as philosophically serious. It was, in every important respect, the ideal myth. The universalization of the samurai ethic was the political move that made it functional as a national myth. In the feudal system, the samurai code was a class ideology. It defined the warrior class by distinguishing it from the farmer, the artisan, the merchant. The virtues of the samurai were not available to everyone. They were available to those born into the warrior class and formed within its institutions. The hierarchy was part of the point. To claim that the farmer could aspire to samurai values would have been, within the feudal system, to threaten the social order that the values were designed to sustain. Nitobe's universalization, the claim that Bushido's values are available to any Japanese person, that the national character is an expression of these values rather than a specific class's property, is not a description of how the system worked. It is a transformation of the system for new political purposes. The class ideology becomes the national identity. The warrior's virtues become the citizen's virtues. The formation that was once transmitted through the samurai household is now transmitted through the national school system. The Meiji Educational Rescript of 1890, issued 1 year after the Meiji Constitution, and representing the state's comprehensive statement of the values it intended to produce through the national school system, made the transfer explicit. The document placed loyalty to the emperor at the center of the national curriculum, as the direct descendant of the Confucian virtues of filial piety and loyalty, to one's lord. The child who learned to honor his parents was learning, at the same time, to honor the emperor. The citizen who served the state was expressing, in the modern register, the same virtue that the retainer had expressed in the feudal register. The transfer is presented as natural continuity. It was, in fact, a political construction, a decision to map the emotional and motivational structure of the lord-retainer relationship onto the citizen-emperor relationship, without acknowledging that the two are not the same relationship, and that the mapping requires the suppression of significant differences between them. The historical samurai world that Nitobe idealizes was organized primarily around violence and its regulation. The Sengoku period, the century of near-continuous civil war that preceded the Tokugawa unification in the early 17th century, produced a warrior class whose primary competence was the organized application of force, whose social world was structured by military hierarchy and martial skill, and whose conduct in war routinely included massacre, the burning of civilian settlements, and the systematic destruction of the agricultural base that supported competing powers. The peasant class that provided the material support for the samurai's existence experienced the samurai's presence primarily as extraction, tax collection by force, and occasionally as the random violence of men whose social position made them unaccountable for what they did to people below them in the hierarchy. This is not the world Nitobe describes. His samurai inhabits a world organized around the virtues of the ideal, rather than the practices of the historical. The selection process through which the ideal is constructed from the historical material follows a consistent logic. Take the best examples, present them as representative, erase the exceptions, and then present the construction as a description. The 47 Ronin are real. The virtue they demonstrated, sustained loyalty to a dead lord, maintained across years of hardship, was genuinely operative in their case. But they are called the 47 Ronin because 47 out of a lord's several hundred retainers participated. The rest did not. Most accepted the dissolution of the household, dispersed, and found new lords or new occupations. This is the historically representative response. The 47 Ronin are the exception, the extreme case that demonstrates the ideal is possible, not the average case that demonstrates how the system normally worked. Nitobe presents the exception as if it were the demonstration of the system's normal operation. The exception becomes the type, the average disappears. The ideal is presented as the tradition's center rather than its furthest limit. The parallel with Western chivalry is more instructive than Nitobe intended, and for different reasons than he used it. He deployed the parallel to argue for equivalence. Japan has its own chivalry, as sophisticated and philosophically serious as Europe's. The parallel is real, but it cuts both ways. Medieval European knights were professional killers organized around military hierarchy and the extraction of agricultural surplus. Their conduct in war included everything that Nitobe's samurai's conduct excludes: rape, massacre, the killing of civilians, the burning of crops. The chivalric code, the elaborate system of rules governing the treatment of noble prisoners, the conduct of tournaments, the obligations of the Christian knight, was a literary construction produced by clerics and court poets that described the ideal rather than the practice and served the political need of a military elite for a legitimizing self-image. The historical knight was not the knight of the romances. The parallel with the historical samurai and the samurai of Bushido is exact. Both constructions select the best material universalize it, erase the exceptions, and present the result as the tradition's authentic center. The difference is in what the construction was then used for. European chivalry became a literary tradition, influencing novels, poetry, and the self-image of various aristocratic classes. But it was not directly applied as military doctrine in a way that required specific behaviors of specific soldiers in specific battles. Bushido was. The Japanese military's adoption of Bushido as the explicit ethical framework for the conduct of soldiers, formalized in the Imperial Rescript to soldiers of 1882, and intensified through the late Meiji and Taisho periods into the militarism of the 1930s, transformed the literary construction into operational doctrine. The soldier was told that the samurai's values were his values, that the samurai's acceptance of death was his duty, that surrender was dishonor in the same way that the samurai's abandonment of his obligation would have been dishonor. The leap from Nitobe's philosophical argument to the kamikaze program is not one step. It passes through 30 years of military ideology, political crisis, imperial expansion, and the logic of total war. But the vocabulary is continuous. The word used to justify the pilots' deaths is the same word Nitobe used to describe the 47 Ronin's completion of their obligation. Romanticized traditions are not harmless. This is the conclusion that the book's afterlife forces, and it is the conclusion that the most common reading of Bushido, as a beautiful text about a noble tradition that was tragically misused, resists. The misuse was not an accident. It was a predictable consequence of the structure of the construction itself. A tradition that places death acceptance at the center of its ethical system, that frames the willingness to die as the precondition of full virtue, that treats survival at the cost of honor as the ultimate failure. This tradition, applied to the conduct of soldiers in a total war, produces specific outcomes. The construction did not determine the catastrophe. It provided the vocabulary within which the catastrophe was organized and understood by those who participated in it. The soldiers who chose death over surrender were not making an idiosyncratic decision. They were acting within a framework of values that their entire formation, educational, military, cultural, had presented as the highest expression of what it meant to be Japanese. The tradition's absorption into post-war Japanese corporate culture is the quieter catastrophe, quieter because no one dies, or at least not from the obligation itself. The company, as the object of loyalty replacing the Lord. The long hours as the expression of self-sacrifice. The shame at individual failure. The group solidarity that is experienced not as a social benefit, but as a demand. The expectation that the employee's personal life is legitimately subordinate to the organization's needs. That leaving the office before the senior colleagues have left is a failure of loyalty as much as a scheduling decision. These patterns are not universal in Japan, and they have been changing, but they have been real and structurally significant. They represent the Bushido vocabulary applied to the capitalist firm. The formation Nitobe described has been channeled through the corporate institution in the same way it was channeled through the military. The specific content is different. The structure of total obligation is the same. The ethics of the non-economic self, Bushido's most striking feature, its willingness to describe the samurai's virtuous life without reference to material conditions, its presentation of the noble warrior as existing in a realm above economic calculation, became, through the chain of institutional absorptions, the ethics of total economic commitment. This is the tradition's deepest irony, and perhaps its most revealing one. The tradition was constructed to demonstrate that Japan had values that transcended material interest, values that the West could recognize as philosophically serious precisely because they were not organized around economic calculation. That tradition was then used to justify a form of economic organization that demanded precisely the subordination of personal interest, personal time, and personal life to the organization's economic purposes. The samurai's willingness to die for his lord became the salary worker's willingness to sacrifice his health and his relationships for the company's quarterly earnings. The form of the obligation survived intact. The purpose it served was transformed beyond recognition. Nitobe, writing to answer his wife's question about where Japanese people get their morality, could not have known he was also writing the ethical framework that would organize the lives of millions of people in conditions he could not have imagined, serving purposes that would have been incomprehensible to him. But that is what constructed traditions do. They outlive their constructors. They serve purposes their constructors never intended. And the gap between the intention and the consequence is the most important thing the tradition finally teaches. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.